Well, author and analyst Dr. Robert Gutsche joins us now from Lancaster University. Robert, lovely to have you with us. He was calling for bipartisanship, but it didn't take long for Donald Trump to re-emerge, railing against the Mueller investigations and others.
Well, certainly, Donald Trump is an entertainer before he's a politician. And we saw that in his State of the Union address, finding these punchlines to come out and say that Americans shouldn't be questioning the people who are leading them, quite frankly, an anti-democratic viewpoint, if I've ever heard one.
Yes, he was aiming for something of a mix of bipartisanship and reaching out, but it ended up being quite a combative State of the Union to a degree, with him really reinforcing his entrenched positions on issues like the wall, like the investigation. How will he be able to bridge that divide?
Well, one of the other signs of this sort of these maneuvers that he's doing is when you're hearing chanting from members of Congress, USA, USA, a chant that you hear often at sports, international sporting events, but also in times of danger in the United States. A lot of people screaming USA, USA after the Boston bomber was captured, and people using that as kind of a rallying cry to come together. So he's placing unity of his party above unity of the country, and really setting stage for the next 2 years of creating fear and divide. Certainly, there are conversations that need to be had about immigration and the bipartisan support in the past to create a wall of some sort. But the speech that we heard last night seemed to really come from a position of pitting one party against another and pitting the average American against the outside world.
How much do you think that speech was still aimed at his base?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it is about maintaining that base, but also growing it. Of course, sending military to the Mexican border is not just, for instance, isn't just a military movement or a political movement, but it is one to create a whole other segment of people to support Donald Trump in his base. It's bringing in a military constituency, for instance, to build political capital. And so the speech last night was to find people who are on the fence, people who just couldn't quite get behind him in the past, and touch those moments of fear and touch those moments of the real life of Americans to bring them on board.
The State of the Union is so often used to address big domestic agendas. Now, they seem to be very thin on the ground in this address.
Well, and you heard from, Stacey Abrams in the Democratic response afterwards, a completely different narrative. And that often happens. You have whomever the president is positioning, himself. And then you have counter proposals that are presented at the end. So that's pretty normal. But in this case, you heard about, the difficulties of gun violence in everybody's everyday life. You heard the actual challenges that it takes to put Medicare and Medicaid back together for those who can't afford private health insurance. And they were a completely different narrative about the average everyday American. So if you listen to Donald Trump and you listen to the other side, as you would in almost every State of the Union address and response, you really did hear how divided the country is.
He, interestingly enough, almost claimed the Democratic women, most of whom were all dressed in white and really immovable through large parts of his speech. He tried to claim them of his own, but of course these are going to be the women that are going to be a real thorn in his side.
Yeah, that was really quite interesting. It wasn't the first time that women had come together with colors or with some sign of unity in Congress, but last night certainly was quite telling, particularly telling about what side of the aisle they were sitting on. And you did see Donald Trump, which was really interesting, calling for more women in the workforce, saying there are more women in the workforce. But when you look at his own record of how he's treated women, or the stories about how he's treated women, and certainly the things that he said, it's really hard for many voters who he might be trying to go for, but certainly members of Congress, to believe what he's saying about equality and about equal treatment and about women in society in general. But last night's display was quite interesting sign of unity, and I think is a story going forward that's not gonna die.
No. In terms of foreign policy, he again restated his views that are in contrast to his own intelligence people, particularly around North Korea. How much are we going to see? How much progress are we really going to see? And is this one of the areas that he plays to be the statesman, to be the achiever?
Yeah, the conversation about having more meetings about North Korea and Vietnam, and in fact the way he said Vietnam, just kind of brought back some images of a war that we might have once fought there that went on far too long. The amount of parallels to questionable history of U.S. democracy certainly is coming through in a lot of Donald Trump's policies, and I think what we're seeing here is another 2 years of questionable movements about international relations. At the same time, he's basically giving up on relationships with Europe and parts of the global South. In fact, they're threatening to bring in military action if they don't like the person in charge in Venezuela, for instance. So his position on international relations has always been quite interesting. The people he has surrounding him, i.e. John Bolton and others who call for military action almost constantly. And so going forward, it'll be interesting to see who he really wants to align with in a global stage.
Robert, appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Sure.